believe that we are getting our information about the world very much through listening and watching and visual and much more intense. And by the way, also listening to people that we feel as a friends, even if we have not listened to them at all and never meeting them before. So it's back to a different world.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's a good way to maybe kick off our conversation because I'll say, just even thinking about it right now, I feel like this period of the first however many weeks, I've lost track, 6 weeks? How many weeks into
5,
Trump are we
maybe?
at this one? 5, 6 weeks into Trump?
Who knows?
It's just moving so quickly that writing is actually very difficult on this. I feel like, working at the paper, you wake up every morning, it's like, I'm already behind. What else has he done? What's blown up? One of the key things that, we want to have you on to talk about is Europe, our relationship there. And the real pivotal moment for that was the speech by J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference. That seemed like a moment that just ruptured in many ways. And it was delivered orally. There's been a lot of sort of movement, but I've yet to read anything, particularly trenchant about the moment and what's happened since. So I figured, it'd be great to have you on to just talk about the situation in Europe, and I have so many questions and ideas about the current moment more broadly and liberalism and the rest of it. But let's just start with that. I mean, how did that land, Ivan? And just give us a sense of, now in Europe, has anything changed since the J.D. Vance speech in Munich? Has it ruptured something and people are thinking differently, or is it just, a blow is delivered and kind of like it's a chicken with its head cut off and it's running around but doesn't know it's dead yet? I mean, what does it feel like in Europe right now?
Listen, I was in Munich. I listened to the speech. And the first interesting story about the speech is that the rumor was that it was not the speech that he was planning to deliver. But then there was his interview in the Wall Street Journal, and the White House wasn't happy with the title of the interview and so on, and then he decided to make a speech. Why this is important is that in a certain way, this was a speech which was not carefully prepared. It was much more of a talk. And people all the time started immediately talking about Munich 1938, and my analogy was totally different. It was very much like Gorbachev coming to East Berlin in October 1989 to tell Honecker and his comrades that they're on the wrong side of history, this time on the wrong side of Trump. And also, this was interesting because I do believe that Vance believed every single word that he was saying. Secondly, that part of the shock was that he said something that Trump and his people have been repeating all the time. But the most important about Europe, and to understand why this shock was so big, was that Europe managed to convince itself that there is no difference between Trump 2 and Trump 1. So the story was, we have been doing this before, we're going to handle this idea that Europe always believed that we're the adult in the room. So, and you have this eccentric American, and he's doing this and that, and of course we don't like what we see. But at the end of the day, he cannot not understand how important Europe is for the United States. And I'm saying this because the biggest problem is that this is a major psychological difference. And in the moments like this, as you said, it's the speed. So everything is changing very fast. From this point of view, Trump is doing what Lenin once said. There are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen. So basically, now we're in this decades happening moment. But Europe has one major characteristics. Europe can be stupid or wise. It can basically be brave or coward, but Europe is slow. So in a certain way, all the European decision-making was based on the idea of that slow is beautiful. Mm-hmm. Everything should be deliberate, everything should be taken care. And then suddenly he comes, and this is the speed, it's not the direction. And suddenly Europe is off balance. And suddenly, and this is what happened in Munich, many people understood that Vance is not saying this in order to achieve this or that. He's saying this because he believes it. And even Trump is saying this because he believes it. And of course, it was not 1989 to the extent that in 1989 there were people on the street who were basically telling Gorbachev, cheering him, told this to them. So there was not these people on the street in Munich. And also, of course, AfD is not the majority of Germans. But at the same time, this sense of change and that something is ending was very difficult for Europe to accept, because Europe was the biggest kind of a beneficiary of the post-Cold War decades, in a psychologically much more than China, much more than the United States. As German diplomat Thomas Bagir once said, the end of history was an American book, but it was the German reality.
Mm-hmm. You know, the thing that I heard that rumor that he didn't mean, that was not the speech he was supposed to deliver. I know that was going around Munich. I know, however, that there was another rumor going around Munich that it was written for him in the White House. That's not true. I can confirm that that's not true. It was written by his staff. And I think one thing that you noted there in passing is that it was sort of spoken, and it was a little hastily. You could tell it was hastily composed. But it was absolutely heartfelt, I think. And this is the one thing that I'd sort of like to drive us on in this stuff, is because, you know, the reality that I think most Europeans are only now coming to understand is this question of how their liberal value set is perceived in some quarters of the right in America. You know, what really struck me was when, you know, there was that performative vote in the European Parliament when Roe versus Wade was overturned, condemning, you know, what the Americans had done on abortion rights. That infuriated so many conservatives on such a profound level, saying this is the kind of decadence that we're trying to fight in America. This exactly. So when I saw Vance's speech, it was a clear, you know, it was a heartfelt, not tactical speech to sort of alienate. I think a lot of people are trying to read into that, but it was we reject so much of what you believe are core values, and you know, our side of the fight in politics and polarization, we reject this. And it's the same thing as the sort of the fight domestically in the United States, is the sort of fight against this idea in Europe. So it's this kind of, you know, liberalism, I don't know, illiberalism, post-liberalism, conservatism versus liberalism is the way I'd really would really think of it at this point, because it's not some kind of post-liberal thing. It's outside liberalism, but it's definitely against it and very heartfelt.
I don't doubt that Vance believed in what he was saying quite strongly. I think Vance is a believer, but at the same time, I think that there was a tactical aim, and maybe this is more of a Damir way of looking at things, but it was a way of asserting dominance over Europe, of saying, we are America, we are the superpower, we can do whatever we want, we can say whatever we want, and you guys have to take it because you do depend on us for your security umbrella, and you have for decades. And so there's something very Trumpian about it. This assertion of force, a way to cow not just your opponents, but also your friends into submission. And in some ways, I think it worked. It has shaken things up. It has fundamentally changed the way people are talking about the future of Europe. And I think, Ivan, you've said that this Trump administration, Trump 2.0, is quote unquote a revolutionary government. And I think that gets at something very important, that the Trump administration wants to be seen in history as reshaping the world, as reshaping Europe, as undoing what was done before. So, you know, we've talked about 1989. I think that the Trump era, this Trump era, could be remembered potentially in the same breath as one of these moments of a fundamental shift in the world order.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. This is why I even don't believe it's so much about liberalism versus conservatism. I do believe it's about revolution. And from this point of view, it is exactly how I see it. Revolution, by the way, divides the world only on enemies and friends. By the way, revolution does not have allies.
Yeah. Yeah.
It has friends and enemies, and from this point of view, for me, and I could be totally wrong, but after reading what I'm reading and trying also to remember certain things from 1989, 1990, is that There are two keys through which you can understand Trump and basically this administration. One is Mao and the Cultural Revolution. But I'm not saying this as a way of criticism. And Orwell, one of the great American sinologists, made this comparison because on one level, you really try to see the state as your enemy. So for him, the state is the deep state. On the other side, you have also an old man that wants to stay in history and to settle scores, but strangely enough, settle scores not only with his contemporaries, but also basically with his successors that he believes are going to betray what he wants to achieve. And on this level, the most important is the radical nature of action. And it is radical. And one of the things that people don't understand is that this strange libertarian impulse that go together with the populist impulse meet in one point. You're trying to fight bureaucracy by concentrating power in a charismatic leader. So less states means more emperor.
Yeah.
And because basically Trump's administration very much functions as an imperial court, and really people are very much afraid to get on the wrong side of him, people are focusing on this imperial side of the court, not understanding the real revolutionary intention. And when you said about international order, and this is my second way to understand him, is basically he's Gorbachev. Listen, if you try, what Europeans didn't get, in my view, we Europeans didn't get, is that we talk about Ukraine, and when he goes to the Russians, and we said, oh, what he's going to do about Ukraine. But for him, it's not about Ukraine. This is about remaking the world.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, he goes there, and he said to the Russians, on the base of Ukraine, I'm going to convince you that you should trust me, and we're going to make a totally different world. And you are not treated fairly after 1990. And we can do it. And I was ready already in 2016 to go with this grand bargain, but then the deep state stopped me. And then he should do things which are unthinkable in order to convince Russians that they should take him seriously. And funnily enough, by the way, this is what Gorbachev did in 1980s to the West. And funnily enough, the Russians are treating basically Trump in the same way the Americans were treating Gorbachev. Very careful. He's talking about the big thing. Americans back then were talking about Germany. At the same time, the Russians were talking very much about Ukraine. He's coming with the big visions. He's talking about...
Is he going to destroy the American empire like Gorbachev destroyed the Soviet empire?
But he's destroying it because he believes that American empire is basically what constrains America. And this was the same with Gorbachev. In a certain way, he does not see empire as positive. He believes that basically America was not a hegemon. America was basically a hostage of its empire. And by the way, this always happened. The empire normally collapses when suddenly the center starts to see itself as the hostage, not as the hegemon. But the thing that, in my view, Vance slightly missed when he was doing this speech is every revolution has political enemy that we know, and this is the nationalism. So the moment he came, the moment he talked, the moment he said, I have their good guys, they're our revolution there, immediately what happened is the mainstream party, and in this case, Merz more than anybody else, he said, it's not up to you to tell us, we're the sovereignists. We are speaking national interests. Germany is not going to be bullied. And Canadians with the Canadian Liberals, Canada is not going to be bullied. So suddenly European politics was totally redefined. And now European politics, this is a kind of a clash between Trump-allied right-wing populists, who now are the internationalists, and a much more pro-European national interest, national dignity-centered mainstream party. And of course, you can see it. This type of gaullism was typical for France, but never for Germany. And suddenly, basically, Merz is speaking the language which he's speaking French, let's put it like this, when it comes to international politics.
It's really good, though, right? I mean, one would argue this is exactly what Europe needs: is to be snapped out of that 1989 universal ideals moment and understand that their needs, their interests, their strategy has to be particular, not global and universal. So it's a huge favor he's doing Europe, ultimately.
No, listen, the problem with every revolution is that it cannot be aware of its unintended consequences, because every revolution basically starts to have a dynamics of its own. Trump has unleashed major kind of energies in different parts, both in the United States and outside. And I do believe that the major story for Europeans, but also for the Democrats in the United States, is to understand that, listen, you can resist tyranny. You cannot resist revolution. Revolution should be hijacked. It should not be resisted. Because basically in every revolution, there are different revolutions going at the same time. And you think in the United States, so you see Musk on one level, but Bannon on the other, and you're trying seeing that. And we remember it very well from the Bolshevik Revolution or even from 1989. So when people are telling me I don't understand what Trump is doing, honestly speaking, I do. I remember 1990, I remember 1991, and I remember the anti-communist forces coming to power and putting strange people in the ministries and so on, because the most important quality of this person should be that he or she could not be co-opted. The state was perceived as such an enemy that basically not being co-opted is going to be the major virtue. And the biggest problem of this revolutionary politics is that when it starts to have a kind of a dynamics of its own, the commander-in-chief is never in control. Mm-hmm. At best, he is in charge, but never in control.
To drive this point home a little bit more, I mean, are we sort of saying here that as much as I think the three of us don't like Trump, that ultimately this second Trump presidency could be a good thing, at least a good thing for Europe, that he unleashed something that was necessary for Europe? Europe had to sort of come to a different realization about the age that we're in, and only someone like Trump could have made that possible. I mean, do you see it ultimately that Trump had to happen in this sense? Trump was necessary from like a historical standpoint.
No, totally. Listen, first of all, this is the magic of the revolution. Something that till yesterday was perceived unthinkable, the next day is seen as inevitable. Mm-hmm. But I do believe, obviously, America was ready for change and the world was ready for change. Mm. Should this change necessarily take this shape? Could it have done from a different type of an actor? Probably. But one thing was very clear, and this was that the liberal order created after the end of the Cold War was exhausted. And don't forget, for the last 10 years, one of the major kind of a title for most of the articles published here and there was that it has ended. And the problem is that I don't believe that Trump came and killed liberal order. He much more buried it. Mm-hmm. And from this point of view, the problem is that at the same time, he unleashed a political energy, but this political energy can go in a very different direction. On one level, you see a major shift of power towards the richest and the most powerful people in the world. On the other side, you have a very strong anti-capitalist sentiment in many places. So this is a revolution, but this revolution basically does not have a name. And this is kind of an interesting story. And by the way, this is something that happened to the revolutions already in the beginning of 20th century. Before, when you see people on the street, you know who they are. Are they fascists or communists? Basically, the revolutions has political names, ideological names. And it is in the 21st century that the revolution started to have kind of technology names. Twitter revolution, Facebook revolution. Suddenly, it was much more, the medium was the message. And the story with Trump is that we still don't know what is going to crystallize at the end of this. Is it going to be a much more libertarian story of cutting the state? Is it going to be a much more populist? How nationalist it is? Because he's not isolationist till now. He's trying to remake the world, but remaking the world is not isolationism. He's not coming back. And also his trade policies, what this is he going to break basically the global trade system and so on. So it's so interesting because and one of the reasons people are so much either supporting or hating him, because it is easy to basically love Trump or to hate Trump than to understand what is happening.
You know, the one thing though that I think the revolutionary mindset is I think very important to keep in mind. But I do want to get back to this question of ideology, and revolutions have their logic outside of ideology, but they do, as you said, have a friend and enemy thing that is very critical. And the part that I've been sort of coming back to is what what constitutes the enemy for Trump and his people. This past weekend was CPAC, the big conference, conservative conference here in D.C., and there were a bunch of parties. I went to two of them, one at the beginning, which was like a Steve Bannon party, one at the end, which was a sort of a Doge appreciation party. And it was a really interesting sort of sociological thing to be there. But there was a, I don't know how else to put it, it was a kind of barbarism among the people there, like an enthusiasm about destruction that is palpable, especially among the young people that are there. So, we look at Trump, but as you said it yourself, he doesn't know what he's sort of unleashed in many ways, or, the leader can't control what's happening. This is something new has been infused in it. And you were saying, what kind of revolution is this going to be? What does it look like? What I keep coming back to, I've actually just gone back and done a bunch of reading to sort of remind myself of it, is actually the German Revolution of 1918. And I hate to do the sort of German interwar thing because it's so hackneyed and so trite. Nevertheless, there was a, call it a threat from, call it the left, the Spartacists, Rosa Luxemburg, and in the formation of that moment in Germany, forces were unleashed to quash that kind of thing. And I think really you could to not to put too fine a point on it, but like the whole sort of woke DEI thing really does fit onto that sort of very aggressive leftism. That's putting it too kindly, like a destructive, communism that then society gelled against, which I think we saw against Trump as well. Trump was brought to this. But to quash it, he needed the barbarians, just like the German state needed the Freikorps, the like ultra-nationalist, ugly militia to do it. And I just can't help shake the feeling that something has been unleashed in the American body politic that is now with us in a way that it was always outside. And it was necessary to quash the left's craziness in a way. And maybe there was no other way, but we're in a different world right now. I can't shake that feeling politically. That
Damir,
is it libertarian, is it not? Yeah.
Could I
Go ahead,
ask,
Shadi.
this psychologically, where does this enthusiasm for destruction come from among these young Trump supporters? Because I presume that most of them are actually fairly well off, fairly privileged in the broader scheme of American life. And I have trouble relating to this urge for destruction. I want to live a relatively quiet life. I want to be left alone.
We're too old, Shadi.
Yeah, true. I don't love politics. So the idea that you have these people who just want to come in and destroy the system and are excited about it, it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. How does one manifest those desires, or where are those desires coming from? I'm just curious what your impression is. I'll
let Ivan answer, or at least like riff on that one. But I'll just direct our listeners to an essay that was in First Things. I think the guy's name was Matthew Rose. It was about a Leo Strauss essay called German Nihilism, and about basically, again, this kind of moment of, especially, that period of people, young people feeling that liberalism does not provide that kind of stuff, that liberalism is soft and decadent and needs to be destroyed, and leads to sorts of things like abominations, kind of like the whole DEI thing, which feels like an unacceptable softening and deadening of existence. I think this is the wellspring of this kind of right-wing anger, which, call it fascism, call it nationalism, call it something. That essay is terrific. We'll put it in the show notes. Yeah. But I don't know, Ivan, what do you think about what do you make of all of this?
No, that's very important. Listen, every revolution is about intensity. On the other side, there is a major difference with the post-World War I period. And this is, on the streets of Germany, there were ex-soldiers. Mm-hmm. European societies were very young societies. Listen, don't forget, particularly in Europe, you have aging societies, and basically, people are not ex-soldiers. Yeah. So German society was very much transformed, like all European societies, by the war and the experience of war. And secondly, all these communists on the left, fascists on the right, they were kind of a very pedagogical regimes. They didn't like the people in the way they were. They wanted to make a new man. The new man on the left was a new man, on the right were different people, but they wanted to change societies. What struck me in the current moment, Three things. By the way, when Damir said I have this feeling, I was talking to a great German writer, Daniel Kellman, who is now living in New York, and he said, and it was in my view a very interesting observation. He said, when I talk about what is happening in America, I see a major contrast between how this is experienced of people of European origin and people of non-European origin. And also he said there was also so different because while the society was very polarized on one level, but it is not polarized on the top, where you're going to see kind of the rich Democratic donors and the rich Republican donors going basically on the same party and just not talking politics because they don't want to spell basically the relationship. And probably it's not going to be seen at the bottom of society where also kind of this is not where the major politicization comes from. There is a lot of energy, part of this energy, and I agree with you. You can call it revolution or counter-revolution, it doesn't matter. Because basically this is that one of the things that happened is that progressive left did not understand the radical nature of their offer about gender and family and things like this. It was very low. And when people talk about the Cold War, in a certain way people don't understand is that one of the reasons the United States managed to make a big coalition about the Cold War was not so much the attraction of liberalism and the attraction of freedom, it was the power of anti-communism. Because communism was extremely radical on two issues, which for a very conservative society outside of the West were critical. One was communism was trying to kill God, and the second was private property. So suddenly, liberal America ended up in a coalition with very conservative governments in society outside of the West. When the idea of a new Cold War came, and when Biden started talking about democracy versus authoritarianism and so on, and talking about Putin and his message, he didn't realize is that basically in this clash of these two modernities, now America was the radical one. And Putin and the Chinese were the conservative one. Because America was going very much at the heart of the family and personal identification and so on. And for many people who does not need to be very much on the right, this was really very, very much going to their basic understanding of the world and what is happening. So as a result of it, you're going to have this. We now know sociological data. The young Europeans, but also the young Americans, the gender divide among the younger population is incredible. For example, if you're going to see the people who voted on the last German elections between 18 and 24, first you're going to be surprised to see that majority of people on this age who voted either for the far left or for the far right.
Yeah.
But the women voted for the far left mostly, and the men for the far right mostly. So you have this divide, and this goes very much to your story, that it is basically also about this. But secondly, and this is going to be interesting, what in my view, even people like Bannon are not getting, and Bannon is a classical Trotskyist figure. So I'm not saying this is a criticism. Trotsky was one of the most interesting figures of the revolution. But obviously, they don't understand that the moment you become a revolutionary players, first, revolutions do not respect borders. So while basically all the time Trump is saying, I don't want to interfere in the politics of other countries, he means only in the politics of the big authoritarian states, but he's interfering in the politics of European democracies all the time. But the moment you're basically, as we talked before, mobilizing this national response. And this is also going to change, and I don't know how this is also going to affect America, because the other story for Europeans is Europe always believed that we understand America because it's slightly like European politics. I knew that it's not true. And by the way, when we try to believe that we understand America, you go to New York, but New York was important in 1950s, where you're going to see all these people coming from Europe, either people running from fascism or people running from communism, and this is where Cold War liberalism was cooked. Now, in my view, it's Miami. It's Florida. You have all these people coming from Latin America. They're running from Latin American progressive governments. They're coming with their fears, with their nightmares, with this and that. And in my view, this change is critically important on this ideological level, because what is absolutely amazing about Trump is that the strength of Trump is that you cannot define him ideologically. In a certain way, he's intensity based on confusion. On many issues, he's not consistent in his views. I'm absolutely sure that on abortion, he doesn't care at all.
Yeah.
And funnily enough, this is not the thing that he's going to die for. So in a strange way, the revolution, always the question is, which is the hill on which you're going to die for? And I know only one hill on which he's ready to die, and this hill is called Donald Trump.
Yeah.
So as a result of it, he allows people to imagine him in a totally different way, but how long it's going to be? And from this point of view, of course, Vance is very interesting. And listen, some of the things that Vance said in Munich were not necessarily wrong. What totally was wrong is not to understand that, first of all, freedom of speech, by the way, people forget why we support freedom of speech. You support freedom of speech because only by the freedom of speech you can reach truth. If you don't believe that there is truth, the freedom of speech is a totally different exercise. And of course, he had a point on the Romanian elections, in my view, and I have been making the same point before him, but on the other side, to try to believe that the only kind of a freedom of speech means freedom of speech of my own, this is the most anti-liberal.
Ivan,
now when they're in power, if they believe in freedom of speech, so basically they should allow to their opponents to get vocal. And this is not there.
I really want to drill in on this because just a quick little anecdote on the Romania stuff. It is the most undercovered thing in American media, I think. It's a story, it was a blip that came up. I remember talking to Shadi like 2 weeks ago about this, and he was like, wait, what the hell happened in Romania? I didn't even know it. I think it's one of the most insane stories in Europe. And quite frankly, I would just love it for you, for listeners who I'm sure are much closer to Shadi's sort of awareness of this issue than you and I are. And quite frankly, I'm not that plugged into it. What exactly happened? If you can just sort of give a quick outline. I think it ties on to everything you're saying. Truth, understanding of how truth is manufactured, created, what it is, disinformation, misinformation, all these, I think, really toxic ideas that have sprung up in the last couple of years. Just give our listeners just a quick understanding of what happened in Romania in the last few months.
Damir, if I should be fair to you, my answer should be if I only knew. But basically, the story is the following. Romania ended up with a very difficult grand coalition government in a very turmoil period. By the way, Romania is the second biggest East European country, quite important, on the border of war. They had a quite rapid economic growth for the last 5 or 6 years, but now basically ended with a lot of inflation and the persistent accusation of corruption, which is typical for this southeastern part of Europe where countries like Bulgaria and Romania are. And then you have the presidential elections, and on these presidential elections, there is a candidate that basically nobody has heard of, who, by the way, claimed that he didn't spend a single dollar on his campaign, and suddenly, in the last 2 weeks of the campaign, through TikTok and others, there is a lot of videos about him, and he ends up as the number one on the presidential elections. And then the Constitutional Court, on the basis of the fact that they saw that there was a interference, technological interference that he didn't declare, that there was almost 1 million spent on this campaign, decided to renew the elections. Listen, here you have 3 or 4 of the paranoias of any modern democracies that starts. The first is this fear that basically you don't know where the people anymore, because there was a genuine anger. And in my view, the person who basically tried to play this, of course, the Russians probably were part of it. But normally when you go on these technologies are so easy that you don't need Russians for this. Normally you have local players playing this. And because Moldovan elections was nearby and the way how to influence was very easy to be done. The second thing is the end of the information borders. Governments used to have a monopoly over information space to a certain extent. So in this moment of a collective panic, where you have the whole political elite, because don't forget, the second person who ended on a number 2 position after the first round of presidential elections was also not a representative of any of the parties of the Grand Coalition. So the 2 big parties that has a major majority, none of their candidates managed to enter the second round. And then they decided to use the national security argument. And listen, I cannot judge what they really know and don't know, and they publish certain documents about interference. But my position always was that first, Interference is what is going to happen to democracies when it comes to the information sphere. Secondly, Russians were never shy of interfering. But basically, this is a new reality. And thirdly, that there was a genuine resentment to what is happening in the country. And it is because of this genuine resentment this polling came. The guy who basically won the first round is just a character coming from a kind of satirical TV show. So it's not simply people normally are going to say his political position, he's going to be against NATO, he's pro-Putin. First of all, it's still putting too much consistency in his views. He believes that Romania is the center of the world. He believes that water should be not drunken from bottles because by doing this we are missing important information. So he's one of these eccentric characters who is on the margin of politics, but because of it, he's successful. So probably anti-vaxxer and everything that you can imagine. And so he tipped it in this paranoia and conspiracy mentality for part of the electorate, and then you have a collective panic on the side of the establishment. So from this point of view, when Vance, who I don't believe was also overly briefed on this, touched on this, he was touching on establishment that is panicking and people that want change. Of course, I don't believe that he knows anything about this character because this character probably does not know much about his own politics. And then basically, now you enter with the moment in which there are going to be new elections in May, the registration of the candidate, and just 3 days ago, Romanian police arrested the guy and basically said that he, with some of his associates, were trying to change constitutional order. Listen, I don't know. I'm not there. I don't speak Romanian. This is not the center of my interest. It could be true. But the story is that obviously this shows this, on one level, desire of the establishment to keep position very much using the national security arguments and the war, and on the other side, the resentment of the people who basically are ready to vote for anybody just for change. And this is a situation, and this is an interesting situation because, of course, these people after the Musk tweets, and I know that Mr. Kennedy is, for reasons I don't know exactly why, connected to Romania in general and interested in Romanian politics, but this is what it is. And this is how you start a revolution that you don't know anything about. And the funny story is, while Trump, he had a very good argument criticizing the regime change policies of a previous conservative and liberal governments and basically saying and criticizing Tory and Newland on being on Maidan Square. But in a certain way now, Musk is the Maidan Square. Yeah. He's supporting candidates, he's doing a regime change himself, and this is the problem of the revolution. The problem of the revolution is that you don't do what you want, you do what the revolution wants.
Yeah. Look, I do want to underscore just how remarkable the Romanian story is. And I mean, one interesting question is, why was there so little coverage of an outright assault on democracy in the Western press? Why weren't more people outraged? Why wasn't there more coverage in the mainstream media? I mean, this is the first time that elections have been canceled in an EU country since the establishment of the EU. It is actually unprecedented. I mean, usually when people say unprecedented, it's not like actually unprecedented. In this case, it is. And so I was quite shocked when I started to read into it and to try to get a sense of what had happened. And, you know, can you imagine if it happened the other way around, that if you had a right-wing government annulling the first round of elections because they didn't like the results, it would be the #1 story in Europe and in the US. And here it was just a blip. So I just think it shows that there are a lot of liberals, left-leaning liberals, who are not in any real sense committed Democrats. They don't actually believe in democracy. If democracy means the right to make the wrong choice, if democracy means expressing the people's will, even if the people's will diverges from those of elites, that's not actually what a lot of left-leaning liberals in Europe believe in or want. And I think that's the fact that they would express that in the way they did in Romania, and the fact that the rest of the EU would turn a blind eye to it, it's really hard for me to process. And I think we should be very clear about just how it's worth being outraged about this.
Listen, you're totally right, but here's the problem, which you have a problem both on the left and on the right. If you're going to ask the left what is the major threat to democracy, they're going to tell you the right winning the elections. If you're going to ask the right what is the major threat to democracy, and it's going to be the left winning the elections. And this is why, in a certain way, basically, you ended in a situation in which defending your own party is the only way to defend democracy. And in the Romanian case, I agree very much. And as I said, there are probably people who know much more. And I'm sure that there are much more nuances. And probably they're going to be this and that. But like you, when I'm reading this, I see basically an establishment which was trying to preserve their position, and also because of the war situation in Europe, very much trying to use this as a kind of justifying things which normally are not going to be easily justified. And you're totally right. And this is why also people are so disoriented. Because in a certain way, people look around and they said, what is going on? And by the way, I don't know, is this guy going to win the previous time? But now you're making such a hero of him. And suddenly, out of a very much accidental guy, with a very much kind of a marginal situation, this is becoming symbolically the most important elections in Europe, probably after the German and the Polish elections. And this is absolutely an amazing story. And this tells you why we talk about the crisis of democracy in a much more profound sense than you have a populist revolution, or basically you have a progressives which went kind of beyond the pale on certain type of policies.
Yeah. I mean, just to the other thing I wanted to not press you on, but just underline is this question of, lack of information borders. It's that this is seen as a threat to democracy. I mean, if you just take a step back, seems completely preposterous to me, because all that democracy is supposed to do is channel, the understanding and preferences and the common will of whatever you want of the voting public. And now, if the voting public is getting its information, more broadly than it was before, that doesn't make their choice less legitimate. And this was the thing that was so frustrating during the Russiagate stuff in 2016 here, drove me up the goddamn wall of how our entire institutions were convinced that otherwise good American voters were somehow hoodwinked, and the fact that they were hoodwinked meant that their choice was illegitimate. Like as if the only legitimate choice is one made by somehow incredibly rational people that come to the right decision, to the truth, because they have access to perfect information. And this just gets back to this. I think it's an epistemological insanity among these people that talk about this. What is truth? Well, truth is only somehow filtered through the right kind of organs, and if it's coming from elsewhere, this is illegitimate. It's mis/disinformation, as opposed to information, and most voters have to deal with all sorts of information and parse it for themselves. And the parsing of that is the will of the people. Doesn't matter where it's coming from. And so, I think you're right. You described it as a panic about, losing control, and then imagining that the control from outside is somehow larger than it is. That to me is the biggest problem. It's whatever the Russians did, let's say they invested $1 million in TikTok ads to boost this guy. It's TikTok ads, and it's the guy talking at the end of the day. You know what I mean? Okay, it's and that's anyway. Just throwing that out there.
You're touching on something very important. The very legitimacy of people making choice has been in question, and you have two versions of panic. On the right, the version of the panic is the following: the borders open, migrants are coming. Mm-hmm. And governments, particularly pro-migration governments, they're interested in these people coming, not simply because of the fact that they're going to do some jobs or this and that, but because they see in them a potential voters for themselves. So the fear of the right, and it was very strong during the first and the second and the third Trump campaign, was we're going to be in the Brechtian situation in which, because people are not happy with, government is not happy with their people, they're going to elect another people. you're going to have such a major kind of inflow of migrants that basically the government can elect its own people. And on the left, because both left and right cannot recognize people anymore. Both of them are saying it's not my people. What happened to my people? What happened to my people? On the right, the question is, what happened to these normal conservative Protestant Americans? Is it possible for them to vote for this kind of a crazy leftists? It has never happened before. And on the left, the idea was, what happened to my people? Basically, can they vote for the fascists? And this is a very important story because on the left, of course, the problem is about information. It's not because, listen, if you claim that you believe in democracy, you should believe that people are good. But why are the good people basically doing so bad things like electing another party? And then basically, on the left, the problem is about information, misinformation, fake news, and so on. So people are manipulated. So on one left, migrants are coming and voting. On the other, basically, people are manipulated. But one of the things that I found particularly dramatic in the American case, and where Trump has a point which was interesting, is I was very much impressed by Trump going and making a rally in New York just several days before the vote. Every poster is going to tell you that he has nothing to gain. In New York, this is not going to be a state in which he can get a vote. But what has disappeared was that while these parties, both Republicans and Democrats, once upon a time had been a catch-all parties, more and more they start targeting certain groups and not being interested in anybody else. The politics was reduced to mobilize your own people and try to demobilize the others. But as a result of it, you can win the elections, but first of all, you don't need a kind of a national project anymore, and you don't have any type of a social cohesion. By the way, also, you're not trying to persuade anybody to change their vote. Just keep their voters at home and get my voters to vote, and that's it. And in my view, this kind of a way of making politics does not work. And then suddenly Trump comes, and for reasons which I do believe is very much about vanity than about political strategy, for him New York matters, he goes in the Madison Square Garden. But suddenly he goes knowing that there are not votes there. And I do believe that this is quite important if political parties are going to change their position, that in a certain way, the way they're campaigning, the way they're doing politics, and of course on the left, the way they're selecting candidates, with certain type of criteria which are very much coming out of this and that. This is different. People need a story about what is the future of America, what is the future of Bulgaria. They try to have something that keeps us together. And this is, in my view, kind of disappearing, and this is becoming a huge issue, and this is why the charismatic politicians are doing so well. So suddenly the strength of this guy, Georgescu in Romania, is that everybody turned against him. And listen, you're nobody till the moment everybody you hate starts being his enemies. And then suddenly he becomes your instrument.
Yeah. I don't know, Shadi. Any democracy thoughts on sort of, I don't know, where all this is going?
Look, I mean, it is disappointing that, you know, as I think Ivan captures this really well, that we only believe in democracy when it produces the outcomes that we want or like. And this is really at the heart of the crisis that we face. And, you know, my hope has always been that to make the case, like to just try to persuade people and tell them that we have to reimagine democracy and we have to go out of our way to accept outcomes that we don't like. And we have to, and you can't, it doesn't come naturally to us. Because as Ivan said, oh, they're voting for the other party. Outrageous. How do they have the audacity to vote for the party that isn't us? That is human nature.
But you know, that's it for part one, dear listeners. There's a lot more where that came from. If you're not yet a paying subscriber, please head on over to wisdomofcrowds.live and become one. Help support our work. Hope to see you in the bonus.